He chickened out, we told him. We're going to start up in just a few minutes, so I'd like to invite the pre-session 6 panel to come up and take your seats. Jeanette? Oh, Jeanette, do you want to come up? Are you sure? I think you might be inspired to weigh in. Okay. All right, welcome back. We're in the home stretch. So I am Bridget Kelly. I'm a consultant to the commissioner process, and I am going to facilitate the session that we're about to have, the pre-session session that we're about to have. And what we really wanted to do is just take a moment, take a breath, kind of go back through the journey of the workshop in preparation for the final session, which is really going to be trying to bookend this with kind of stories of what could be in an aspirational future based on the experience of those speakers. So we've invited back either the session lead and or moderator from each of the 5 sessions. And we're not going to ask them to synthesize their sessions. So that would be a monumental task for which we're going to have a proceedings. But we have asked them to go back to some of the themes that were identified as potentially cutting across sessions, and then to pick up to 3 of those themes where there were some things that really stood out to them that they would like to highlight back so that you have it fresh in your mind as we wrap up this workshop and as you hear the final session speakers. We've also asked them to think about at least one of some reflection questions, and I'm going to read those questions because I'd like to also plant them in your minds so that after they have shared their reflections, we'll have some time for all of you to weigh in as well. So those reflection questions were, what do you think is most achievable in what you heard? Where is the field of longevity stuck, and how might we dislodge it? What current norms will need to shift for a new approach to healthy longevity with equity at the center? And who needs to be involved or engaged in the healthy longevity movement and isn't already? So expect to hear some speckling of those reflections and then be thinking about them for yourselves as well. You've met almost everyone who has been, so I'm just gonna kind of walk through each of you. I think Eduardo is our only session lead who didn't moderate. So when we get to you, if you would just share with everyone who you are. Oh, and Kenji, although Kenji was a panelist, so we've met everyone else at least once. So if you would just give a brief introduction, and hopefully you all remember who everyone else is. We've given each session, we're aiming to stick to up to about 7 minutes. So I'll keep an eye on the time. Otherwise, are you feeling ready? Everybody's revved up. It's been a lot of information, and we're gonna say it back in a pithy and insightful way. Okay. I hand it to you. I think so.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, on. Well, welcome to the final stretch. I'm not sure exactly how to do this, Bridget, so if I'm going about this in the way you weren't envisioning, let me know.
I suspect you may.
But I think I have a grid in front of me that I was given, to talk about areas or themes and what the successes, obstacles, and solutions might be. But I heard, before I go to the specific issues of inequity, ageism, metrics, and policy and practice, which I think my session focused on, there were some overarching issues that struck me across discussions, and one is the consistency of people saying that the systems we have are anachronistic and are serving us poorly and don't match our 21st century needs, realities, or goals for a human and humane system of creating healthy longevity. So that's one thematic agreement that I heard, which speaks to the need for really radical re-envisioning. The second thing that struck me is that, including in session one, is that we've learned a lot. We know almost an infinite amount more scientifically and from practice experience and policy experience than we are using. And we know a lot that could actually make a big difference, but what we know doesn't fit within our anachronistic models, and so we're not making use of it. So those struck me consistently. And the other is that many of the places we're stuck we're stuck because we've got the wrong frame for analysis, not necessarily because we don't have solutions. So my understanding, Bridget, is that you want me to focus on particular issues among the ones that you chose from the workshop themes, just to talk about what I heard over the first session. And I would say that, first of all, in terms of inequities, that what I gleaned from the first session, as well as the evidence in the literature, is that we now know that a health span that approximates life expectancy is possible. I don't think we knew that 30 years ago. And that means we know we also know some of the elements that drive that increased health span opportunity. And the challenge is how to figure out how to make that the conditions that everybody can benefit from, because the people who are experiencing it are those with the greatest resources. If we don't do that, the threats are quite grave in terms of worsening disparities. And I think that was a key finding from workshop one. The second thing is that the investment has to be in prevention. I was very struck by Tina Woods's comment in the last session that the NHS is moving from putting 5% of its resources into prevention to 50%. That's a rebalancing which should be a model for certainly for the U.S. I won't speak for anybody else, but that's a very clear bet on where the value is going to be, and it's consistent with the evidence in terms of resolving inequities, high return on investment for health, and I think also reinvesting in the public goods of creating health for everybody. And then I presume that NHS investment matches the other thing that came out in terms of inequities, and that is that we need to invest in health futures across the whole life course at every age and stage of life, because we now know that that actually works and matters from a prevention and health promotion point of view. And finally, from an inequity point of view, if we took that approach, what what I have heard across all the sessions is that we need to talk about how all generations would gain in that enterprise, that it's not a situation where creating healthy longevity would lead to one age group being the beneficiary, but every age group would be the beneficiary, and we would be positioning young people to have a health span that approximates their longer, hopefully longer life expectancy. And finally, if we use the scientific knowledge we have, there is, I think, equity of opportunity in the investments in healthier environments and health-producing conditions, which would have another benefit for many of them, like air pollution, in mitigating climate change. So a lot of inequities wrapped in that one. You want me to keep going?
Minute left for your other two themes.
I'm going to...
You might have more time later.
I would say the other themes were ageism, and I'm going to actually just skip over that because it was so well covered, but say that the metrics we have are... I was very struck by the discussions about how they are so implicitly ageist and explicitly impactful in their ageism. And we need to replace them with metrics, which was discussed by many people, that support the future back vision we create and provide ways to measure progress towards that longer-term goal and set our sights on longer-term goals that we value. So that, to me, was a very critical set of discussions by many people. I'll stop there.
Hi, everyone. So Mosa and I collaborated with these ideas from our session and threading through. And what we found, what we loved was the idea of longevity as a human development goal. Because if we see countries and societies where people are living longer, then something must be going right. And with that goal in mind, this is where we can take it back to the person most involved, which is that person who is aging. And aging in a robust way, aging in a way that avoids institutionalization, and thinking about what does that mean to that person, whether it is through meaningful relationships, through the dynamics of work, through their private life, and whatever creates meaning for them. And then with that at the center, with the person at the center of all of this, then we can think about, well, where does that person live? And going back to the importance of context, which we have heard throughout this entire session. So the importance of context, because context shapes whether you are a visible person in where you live, or it shapes whether you are an invisible person. And if you look at places that are unsafe, you do not see older people and you do not see children. Once a place is safe, then you see both of them reappearing in society. So that's a dynamic of context, but it's also the context of whether or not tech will work in your context. If you don't have access to broadband or even 3G, a lot of your tech interventions will be inaccessible, and that becomes an issue of equity. And if you are unable to buy the tech or afford the tech, whatever it happens to be, then what is our solution? So that context-specific solution has to come out of who is that person in their context and where they live, where they work, where they play, where they grow, whatever gives their lives meaning for as long as they would like, and whatever pathway that takes them, whether it's in and out of education. And as we're thinking about that, context is what will shape intervention, because you can think of the context both at the country level, at an international level, but you can take it down to as small an area as someone's neighborhood. And so we have so many different levels of contextual possibilities for policies, for practice, for interventions, that this is a thread that we saw pervading through everything, and as a way of shaping our thinking toward that goal, that broader goal of longer, healthier lives as a human development index. And then in terms of how we're going to do this, we have to think about the evidence and the different types of evidence. There are so many levels, we know, from just basic opinion all the way up to that systematic review. We need to value all those types of evidence because there are going to be gaps that it's going to take time before we could get to an RCT or before we could have enough data to mimic the conditions of an RCT through various complex statistical methods. So when we're thinking about how we create the evidence and study the context where people age in place or where they age more broadly, then we have to be thinking about how do we pull and create all of this evidence in this new place. And that will address the issues that we were asked to talk about, which is what is actionable. So study more studies of context that's actionable. Where do people age? What do they need to do in those places? And then that will help us identify where the issues of inequities are. Where do the inequities lie? We know it will be different community to community and person by person and culture by culture. And those solutions will have to be context and culture specific. And how much time do I have?
You have 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Ooh.
So, and so where we're stuck is, we're stuck because of what we have not done yet. So in terms of where there are gaps in the evidence, how we've thought about doing things, we know some things that work very well in different places, but there's so much opportunity for places that are, new to older adult populations to innovate, to advance and move forward, to take lessons from what has been done in the past and do something different in the future. And thinking about that in terms of drawing in all the stakeholders who might be involved in ensuring that people can age robustly where they live, work, and play. And so pulling that in terms of, say, again, new to the readers. So in terms of who needs this, I think it's always important to remember that we're taking this back to the person, whomever that person is, and meeting them where they are and working with them in a way that does not pass judgment on what has happened in their life or where they've come from or the choices that they've made, but just meeting them where they are so that we can help them get what they need and fulfill their desires in whatever way makes sense to them as a person.
Thank you. It's the easiest job to be asked to moderate the moderators. I just want to acknowledge. So thank you for the wonderful work you all did earlier and for making my job easy now. And just as a reminder, these panels, these 3 panels are going along that needs of the person-centered care. So we started with supporting the needs of people maintaining capacity, and then we're kind of going through the increasing needs, just as context of, in case you don't remember yesterday.
Okay. We talked about the new models of care, integrated care for people who start to have functional decline. I won't go into the details of the findings. I'll put them in my notes and I can send it to the panel later. But just to highlight some of the key things that I thought were important in those models, because there are now experiences of using population-based models, which involve the community, and the importance of community collaboration and co-production of health. I think that's quite important. And the elements of the funding mechanisms that can be provided to enable that. I think there's certain innovations in UK and many countries where they put budgets together, capitation-based models which provide both health and social care models. I think that would then integrate that model. The other important thing about those models is the importance of looking at assessing functional decline and looking at intrinsic capacities. And there also the issue about ageism. When we talk about declines and disabilities, we are not looking at the capabilities and abilities. So I think we need to be very careful in terms of assessments and the use of language, because language really makes us think in different ways. So maybe we should be looking at the intrinsic capacities, because everyone has residual abilities. We all have disabilities of some sort. None of us are perfect. So this term is really quite archaic in my mind, and it should be used for different purposes, but not in terms of our clinical care. And there also the issue about frailty was also another issue. When we assess for frailty, we want to address some of the components of it. But when we label a person frail, it's got a very different connotation. It conjures the ageism So we need to be careful of these labels that we create in the things that we're trying to change. One key issue also, two other key issues arising from the discussions. One is on the workforce. I think there's areas which I certainly personally have a great concern about, in terms of when it was also brought up about clinical care, our clinical model. Our clinical models are based on cure and do not incorporate care. The clinicians, a lot of the clinicians in each specialty do not think care is their responsibility. They think it's every one else's responsibility. So the whole clinical education must capture this in terms of looking at the intrinsic capacities that the person that we're dealing with requires much more than what we determine. So the needs assessment is not determined by the system or by the doctor or by the nurse, but by the individual that seeks care, because that is a person. That person's needs, as you talked about, is very important. And how do we actually assess those needs in terms of the person's preferences? Because those require resources, because in order for a person to be actually making real choices, to be able to fulfill his or her autonomy, requires a lot of support. Many of us make decisions, but we have difficulty making complex decisions. And there must be resources to support people to make decisions and to make those preferences. I think that's a very important point that we need to address. So the training and the individuals, how do we value this person? It must drive our whole system, the humanness, the humanity that we talk about. And finally, I just want to talk about something which is important for the Commission to look at. We talked about institutions that need to be changed. The institutions, we made some reference to it, but we need to identify the institutions that need to change and need to be changed. So there are different types of these. We haven't looked at them. There vary many, but the more important to me are the institutions of the human endeavor. And these have been referred to, someone talked about the three domains of life: education, work, private life. I think that those concepts are in fact quite archaic. They were developed in the last 2 centuries. In the future human development, are those still the things that should be, right? So I think I would like to propose that at least we start thinking about, instead of education, we look at human development. So the development of a person from cradle to grave. We're growing all the time as we talk about lifelong learning. It's not just learning, but to develop, to grow as a person. And education is one component of it. So that's something that perhaps we need to discuss and configure. The second is not work, not even labor, but the contributions to society. So it's really, because the private life is what we do for ourselves, what we gain, but what we contribute to society can be in labor, can be in work, can be so-called informal work, but those are really quite archaic. So really it's the contributions as part of humanity, part of the human being. We have certain obligations, certain rights, and while we contribute those to society, and those can be quantified and rewarded. So our reward systems in terms of our financing, etc., changes. So we pay people who work, but we don't value the contribution they make in different areas. So the whole concept of financing, of reward systems in society, I think needs to change if we really want to get this vision of a healthy lifestyle. And I think it comes back basically because the humanity and humanness is something which is a value which we should look at, because it provides judgments of what's equal and fair, what are the rights and privileges of ourselves as human beings, and what are our responsibilities and obligations. So that captures in terms of the private role and the social role. So if we think about that in that context, maybe all our institutions would really have to be radically changed.
Thank you. And you've already started to thread through with each other in terms of this idea that we have kind of anachronistic systems or frameworks in which we're trying to put new knowledge and evidence into. Eduardo, please do tell everyone who you are, since we haven't met you yet.
Yeah.
Introduce yourself. Just introduce yourself briefly. I won't count it against your 7 minutes.
Okay. in a way, I'm touching the points that were seen in session 4, plus a little bit, and apologize for the plus. But following on what Yeoh said, I think we depart from one clear assertion. We need to rethink the way aging societies are taught. We cannot have the same ways of conceiving relations between people, economies, societies, as we did in the 20th century. And that reframing is slow to happen. Institutions are very, very difficult to change, as was highlighted by David in the first session. So whatever happens in long-term care is very much defined by the way we approach this reframing of societies in terms of income security in old age, in terms of work, in terms of social protection, health systems, social connections, issues like isolation or lifelong education systems, lifelong learning. All that has to be reframed. And also we have to rethink the nature of aging. I remember when my father was my age, he was just sitting at home, walking slowly. No, I am doing 200 kilometers cycling every week at the same age. So we are aging in a very different way, and the patterns of aging are also defining the patterns of the society we need to live in, we aspire to. So in that sense, if you are a policymaker, you have the challenge of balancing between measures and adaptations to maximize the potentials of older people, of that larger cohort of people over a certain age, and managing also the decline, how to maximize the positives and manage the decline. Usually in Asia, for example, when we talk about policies on aging with governments, and I have some years of experience in that, the immediate mindset takes you to manage the decline. What are the measures that you take in order to ensure a bit of care or access to health, or manage the NCDs, the non-communicable diseases, but not the mindsets are not engaged on how to, for example, what was mentioned in the session, how to use the 6 people in the community who are available, ready to commit, ready to work, capable, in good health, that can contribute to the communities and can contribute the care of those who are in frail state. Well, having said that, I think also one thing that was clear is that, and comes clear in our daily work, is that there is no common understanding of long-term care. When we go and talk about issues of long-term care, people or person-centered approaches, people don't really grasp immediately those concepts, especially policymakers, or the non-communicable diseases. For example, people think of the non-communicable diseases as a huge burden to the health systems, when non-communicable diseases can be delayed, can be prevented, can be delayed, and especially can be managed. But the problems are detection, how systems are geared to engage with people so that people can also detect not only how to live healthy, but how to manage when they have hypertension or when they have a high blood sugar, or some of the common NCDs. Just as an example, but things evolve. Policymakers evolve. In 2006, 2007, I visited, one of the visits I made to China, to Shanghai, and the city government took me to visit a huge retirement home, and they were very proud, showing a house for 1,000 people with, with theaters, with cinema, with daily Tai Chi and different restaurants and all that. But then I said, is this part of your strategy? And then they said, yeah, this is our strategy. But at that time, they were not aware that they cannot build retirement homes for 200 million people. No? So gradually, I think China developed a very interesting strategy of 90-7-3, 90 age at home, 7 at community care, and 3% only in residential area, because they thought they saw it from the economic side, but also from what people wanted. And they carried surveys, and the large majority of people wanted to age at home. No? So I don't know how well those strategies are being implemented, but the intention was there. I think that in Anne Marguerite asks what is long-term care. No, that's the first question, and I think that was the thing that comes clear, that there is still not a clear grasp of that the strategy implies what I don't know. I think the WHO calls the building blocks, so we call the issues of the design of human resources, implies planning on financing, governance. So there are multiple aspects that have to come together in a long-term care strategy. Human resources, for example, unfortunately, Professor Dupin from China could not come, but he highlights that only in China there is 8 million gap of care managers, people to care, not caregivers, but care managers. And that's a profession that should be booming. And I think John this morning highlighted the fact that you can also rebuild economies around care economies that are thriving and perhaps an engine of future economies. No? Adelina highlighted the challenges of financing. There is not only one source, there is clear government commitment and policymakers' commitments and political will, but the financing is the synthesis of multiple sources that have to come together in order to finance. But one thing is clear that has come once and again in every single presentation: people has to be at the core. If we talk about long-term care strategies, people are the object, the subject, and the motive of whatever design is made. The differences between middle-income countries and low-income countries is perhaps the institutional, also government issues. There is a huge, ¿cómo se dice en inglés? Disencounter, I don't know if that's a word, disencounter between ministries of health and ministries of social affairs, for example. Those are very different, and many countries in this region, for example, have the ministers of social affairs who are in charge of long-term care. And there is a dispute between those institutions. Finally, in our sessions, of course, we had the Finbar highlighting the person center. The person is at the core of what we do. Adelina, the financing, and Marguerite, the questions of what is long-term care, what are those building blocks, no? And Ms. Tui highlighted, and I'm finishing in. Am I over my time?
A little bit, but that's okay. Finish up.
I highlighted the innovations of social structure, the intergenerational self-help clubs in Vietnam, for example, are one way of innovating socially. For a long time, we thought innovations equal technology. No, I think without disregard for technological innovations, in this area of work, social innovations are just as important, if not more important, is this collection and this arrangement of people which allows people in Vietnam to look in a positive way to community-based organizations that focus on people, but also link the health and care systems, link the communities to the health care systems that need to be developed. They are very context specific. Some people say it's only in Vietnam. Well, they are happening in Myanmar, in Indonesia, in India, in different countries, no? And to finalize with an anecdote, the AARP of the US sent a group to visit Vietnam to see these clubs because they wanted to see how they dealt with the issues of solitude and income generation and all that. So they visited those associations of older people, intergenerational clubs, and they went back to Washington and they established 2 pilot projects in Washington. And after 1 year, I learned that they had not been successful. They were successful in Vietnam or in the cultural setting of Asia, but somehow didn't flourish in the US. Just to highlight that The context specificity does not relate to the high-income countries exporting models, but also from the other countries exporting models to the high-income countries.
You tied us back nicely to the context specificity for the person that Allison talked about, and then the context specificity of the nation in the policy context, which takes us right into Kenji, summing up.
Okay, so
session we just had
we had a great session, and we have a lesson learned from the United States, UK, Japan, and India, and representing different sectors. And it was quite a useful discussion to understand the lessons learned from each of them about how to transform the knowledge into actions. So Srinas and particularly Tina clearly mentioned about the importance, not just the evidence and knowledge, but also politics and also social movement, including industry engagement. And Srinas gave us a very nice similarity between tobacco control and movement on healthy aging. But through the discussion, I have a three reflections out of this. One is I'd like to echo Eduardo about mindset. So particularly, we can just say, oh, we have to change the mindset. When we talk about the mindset, we are not talking about our mindset, but people outside this room's mindset. But through the discussion, I was still, stuck with the 20th century mindset about aging. Because, as Kazumi mentioned, in Japan, 40% of population will soon to be over age 65. On the paper, on the figure, I can understand it, but I didn't feel a sense of urgency, or in a real terms. But the more I understand the importance of it, the more acute the problem will be. So our mindset is still stuck with the 21st century dogma. And here comes the importance John clearly mentioned at the beginning of this workshop. The forward-looking, long-term vision will be crucial. And I'll give you an example of really bad short-term policy making in Japan. We are still traumatized by the decision making in 1970s when the ruling party made the decision to make the free care for the elderly. That is still traumatizing our nation. And it took more than 40 years to fix it. In 1980s, there is a very common political claim that healthcare will kill the nation. And since then, we have been struggling with the aging population. And in 2000, we introduced a long-term care insurance scheme. And in 2025, we have already registered to integrate prevention, long-term care, and medical care. So the short-term, short-sighted policymaking will definitely harm the future of the nation and the economy. So, and here is the role for the National Academy of Medicine. Politicians cannot do this. We need this kind of opportunity and a platform to give a clear message with a long-term vision for the future. So mindset of ourselves, but also the mindset of the future generation and also people outside this will be crucial with the very long-term, forward-looking, and with a clear future vision. So we need to stretch our thought more extensively. And secondly, I think lots of discussion of whole of nation, and also Srinas provided very nice terminology, partnership for public or common purposes. So we have to move beyond the usual cast of suspects. It's not just public or private partnership, but new way partnership beyond the usual cast of suspect. And I see the opportunities here because we see lots of talks across the sectors. And finally, we didn't touch for the past 2 days. We didn't articulate about the importance of accountability. But Srinas articulated about it. Because accountability is not just for metrics or evaluation. It is to harness the trust. Because in this area, as you know, we don't have a clear new metrics for health aging or even index like a human development index, simplified, clear, quantifiable KPI. We can just generate it. But also it relates to the evaluation framework for complex system intervention real time. So I think we have to carefully look at, again, the accountability framework for this area to harness the trust. In terms of trust, I think the Japanese government is pushing, not in health sector, in the digital economy with the terminology data, what is it? Data free flow with trust? Free flow of data with trust. So, in the IT or digital economy, it's not just technology. It's not just the data platform, but trust is the key to galvanize, unite the movement. So we can just run from that kind of movement, but how to harness the trust and how to ensure the accountability in this healthy aging movement so that we can have a common view and common movement for common purposes. So finally, there are arguments that, we have a fragmented ministry, fragmented approach, institutional change is very difficult. But I see for the past 2 days, lots of concrete opportunities. For example, I just came from Bangkok for the Prince Mahathir conference. In Thailand, as you know, there is a national health assembly where public sector, academic, and private sector and civil society gather together to discuss any issues related to health. They talk about trade and health. They talk about aging society and health. So World Health Assembly is just for Ministry of Health, with some participation from industry or civil society. But we have to go beyond, and there are great opportunities and platforms to facilitate that. So I'll stop here to pass on to Jeanette, who coordinated the sessions.
Thank you. Well, I don't have a lot to say, so I'm going to use the opportunity to reflect on some of the things that I've learned in these 2 days. The first thing that I've learned, it's kind of common sense, but it's quite interesting to kind of aha moment. That is very different taking care of functions than taking care of emotions in aging populations. And let me tell you something personal. I do have a very close relative that is having Alzheimer's disease. And we do have the possibility of caring for her, and we have like 3 persons that are taking care of her. But still, they are taking care of her functions, but not of her emotions. And taking care of emotions of aging population, I think, is something that we haven't, we are not at the same level of knowledge than taking care of functions. And if we believe that the aging population will increase, and then the frail population with mental impairments will increase, we need to understand and know exactly what to do and how to better take care of emotions. So that's one thing that I really learned, very useful. The other thing is that that has a consequence in the goal, because basically if we need to make sure that we take care of functions and we take care of emotions, then the implicit goal of having healthy longevity is that we have to have elders that are functional and happy, and that's a huge task to achieve. The other thing that I like to highlight is that we didn't discuss very much on the role of work on healthy longevity. We kind of touch on that. But I think that one of the problems when you age is that the future is no longer there, right? So there is no future. So and if you don't work, it's even worse, because basically, what do you do with your time? What are you looking forward to? And I do think that reshaping the way we structure our labor force is something important, and that we haven't taken enough attention in terms of policies. There's a lot of work. Ursula, in fact, has been doing a lot of work on that. But it's not that's knowledge that is not being translated into actions. And I think that we need to probably use this group to put that out in a much more strong way. And finally, the other thing that I have been wondering during these 2 days is, that's fine, we are talking about aging on the 21st century, but then we need to imagine, what is it going to be healthy longevity in 30 years from now? Because if not, we'll be stuck in thinking in present time, because we know that our actions are very outdated. But we are trying to get our actions to the present time. But I think that we need to think beyond that and think about what is needed to have a healthy longevity in 30 years from now, to basically to get the conversations, because when you think about it, it's a lot of things that are still not at play as much as they would be. For example, technology, all the development in the P4 medicine, all the changes in the way that societies are being structured, all these movements of young generations that are not affiliated to any political or any affiliation at all. And then a generation that in fact is not really thinking about when they're going to get older, because they are thinking about not having kids, because probably the planet will not be here for humans for a very long time. So I think those questions we need to begin to discuss and go beyond the present to the future. Yeah.
So Kenji and Jeanette both reminded us that this workshop exists in the broader context of the commission process. And so in the time that we have left in this session, we'd really like to focus on feeding into that process a little bit. So that's going to mean doing two things. One, first, we had a workshop already. As you saw in the beginning, there's a framing in which the first workshop focused on social, environmental, and behavioral enablers. This workshop you have experienced, and the third workshop is focusing more on science and technology. So tying in some of those things that you were just mentioning and trying, it's not as easy as it sounds, maybe it doesn't even sound easy, but trying to put them in that envisioning the future and walking back from there instead of starting from the present and tweaking what you can going forward. The first thing we're going to do is hear some reflections from Jenny, who was one of the two co-chairs of the first workshop, about some of the key things that came out. Not to recap that, because that process is also happening, but thinking about what themes did or did not thread through to this one in the ways that the commission intended. So if you would just grab the mic from across the aisle and tell us who you are. Jenny's a member of the commissioner as well as the co-chair of that workshop, and just give us your reflections on the relationships back to the first workshop.
Okay, so Jenny Popey from Lancaster University in the UK, and a privilege to be a member of the commission. So there were many strands linking from the first workshop to this, so I've just picked up a few. And of course, as my commission colleagues would know, I am addicted to equity issues. So that's clearly one of the threads that pull through, and it's a kind of frame for the comments I want to make, really, because what was apparent in the first, and we've moved into the second, and it was particularly apparent in the session on long-term care, is how complex it is to put equity at the centre of this issue, of this debate, really, and that's because whilst we can talk about examples of inequity, what does it mean to put it at the centre is quite a challenge, I think. So a number of the things that we've spoken about as possible disruptors could either enhance equity, they could have no impact at all and leave us where we currently are, or they could actually increase inequities. So I was just going to give some examples of what struck me as some of these disruptors that we're not quite sure, or I wasn't sure from the discussion, which way they might go. So the first one is that we talk about prevention, and we usually mean behavioralism, right? Lifestyle and behavior. And there is a considerable body of research that has framed behaviors as coping mechanisms for people living in very difficult circumstances. So that if they are coping mechanisms and we try and stop people from behaving in these health-damaging way, then they'll probably try and find another way of coping which is equally health-damaging. So I think we need to think very carefully about whether these behavioral interventions are going to improve equity, leave it unchanged, or actually, as some of them have done, is increase inequities. And looking at that research, interestingly, many of the evaluations don't look at differential impact. I was just looking at Sprint, which I think is something that Finbar mentioned. Only 13% of the sample there were low income or lower education. So, and I think that's probably quite common. So that's one example. Another example, actually, which is interestingly, I've been fixated since Linda introduced it with this future back. But one of the strands from the first workshop to this workshop is whether we should look also a little bit at back present. And the example from the last 2 days for me is the focus on the collectivization of risk. And we've been told clearly that in some cases, long-term care, healthcare, the collectivization of risk at a societal level is efficient. It's an efficient thing to do. But we also know from social policy research in high-income countries that the collectivization of risk has a social cohesion dividend, a solidarity dividend. We're all paying in, we all get out, right? But the third benefit of the collectivization of risk, when it's universalist, is that it's non-stigmatizing. It's non-ageist. It's non-classist. And actually, we had a very brief period in high-income countries where we were very committed to universal services. And now they're being fragmented and undermined, really. So maybe one of the things that's come out of the last 2 days that wasn't so apparent in the first workshop was whether we need not only to look to the future, but to look to the past for some of these possible disruptors, really. And that takes me to the final point, I suppose, really, which is about the focus on community approaches and localism, because that was a very prominent strand in workshop 1. We looked at some really fascinating examples of local age-friendly initiatives, for example. And this workshop, we've had some really inspiring examples of local community-focused initiatives around health and social care. But again, there is a body of research that suggests that those types of initiatives are inequity enhancing in low-income communities. That they don't work, they undermine those communities. And there's work on some of the World Bank initiatives in low-income settings that show the same thing. So by giving this responsibility to communities without an equity lens, without thinking about material resources and other kinds of resources, this thing that we think might be disruptive could actually be worsening inequalities. So I think that in a sense, what I'm saying is that we've got strands going from workshop 1 to workshop 2 that are very intriguing and exciting. But what I think we need to think a bit more about is what an equity lens would do for us in thinking about whether everything disruptive is a good thing.
Thank you. So the second thing that will be helpful to the Commission is to hear from all of you. We're certainly interested in things that stood out to you that you really got out of what you did hear, but I think it's even more helpful if you have any reflections on what you didn't hear. Keeping in mind that there are topic areas being covered by other workshops, but within the topic area of this workshop about public health and health systems for healthy longevity, were there things that didn't come out that you identify as important for the Commission to be considering? Or were there things where there was actually divergence? So a lot of what we named here are where things converged. But did you hear any places that there's divergence and you really want to flag for the commission that they're going to have to navigate that in their process? So things that we're missing, things where, maybe there isn't convergence. Yeah.
Can I follow up on the last remark over there? Because I think that's rather important, because there's a tendency when we talk about long-term care and healthcare to say that the person should be in the center. And that's at the outset a logical way of arguing. But I think there's a high risk, as you said, that this will imply a high degree of inequity. Because those who have a high income, a high level of education, will be better able to demand the service they will need. And therefore I think one of the important issues for the Commission would be to say we need a clear measure about what exactly is needs. Then when having defining needs, each country, based on its economy, institution, the approach they would like to take, might make decisions upon what they are willing and likely to say something about and be able, the way to finance, we can leave that for the other one. And secondly, it's not enough to say that we would like to provide care for people. We need also to have a better metric for what in fact is a quality of care. Because otherwise, again, I think we'll risk up saying that somebody have a system, they have somebody who can come there, but as I think several have said, for example, continuity is an important issue in long-term care, so that could be one of the metrics, that is continuity in the care provided for those in need of care when we have defined what is the need we have, because otherwise we would end up in an unequal society with those best able to speak and with money get the best care and the rest gets only a little.
Thank you. I think I saw someone back in the back. I imagine someone was just stretching.
Oh, me. It wasn't me then. So I'd like to pose a question to the Commission around synergies and interactions. So I think that the work that's being done here is really fascinating, and I would be interested to see how you think that this could articulate with the work on the decade of healthy aging. So 194 countries have asked WHO to develop a proposal for a decade. That's being discussed this week by the Executive Board. It will be discussed by the World Health Assembly. This will become the mandate for future action in countries and with international partners for the next 10 years. There are real opportunities, I think, for synergy and for leveraging these different opportunities. And I would be interested to get your feedback on how you see those synergies and opportunities. Thank you.
Yeah, do you want to?
So, Alana, it would be really valuable to hear you lay out where you see those synergies.
Thank you for the running of the microphone. We're not done with her yet. We need to hear more.
I mean, I think that this is a work in progress. I think that there are very interesting synergies across the life course. I think the focus here is much more about connecting the first and the second phases of life, and I think that that's a really important focus. The decade focuses much more on the second half of life. That was identified by member states as an area which WHO had invested in less and countries had invested in less. But I think making those connections between the first and second half of life are very important. I think that the work that you're doing is bringing out a very strong research agenda, potentially in terms of gaps and opportunities and opportunities for innovation. I think that that could feed in and nurture the work that's happening on the decade. I think that there are other synergies with the other work that the National Academy is doing also on the grand challenges on innovation. I think, looking at connections between real life challenges in countries and how they can also be the basis for looking at innovation. So innovations that address specific challenges rather than innovations searching for a challenge, so to speak, and then looking at how those translate back. How can those investments actually be, used within these broader communities and stakeholders that we will work with across the decade to be able to enable opportunities and innovations for leapfrogging. I think, we heard about the example from Vietnam, where they're going to make similar transitions in terms of population change in 20 years that Japan made in 150 years. So, I mean, there is a real need to advance and innovate in that sort of, future back direction. So, I mean, I think there are lots of synergies. There are probably opportunities where the National Academy is much stronger than WHO in different areas and more flexible that could also be leveraged in terms of the decade.
I have Paula next, but Victor, did you want to speak to this in particular?
I just want to say that you and Elena, I totally agree with you. I think there's a real opportunity to look at how these complement, synergize, and maybe even different from each other. Yeah. And as you pointed out, the life course approach is very much the focus here. Yours is a decade of aging. And we talked about the possibility of maybe putting a meeting together at the World Health Assembly. And I know I talked to CC about this, and we certainly would be very interested in doing that, particularly in outlining the pieces you talked about, because I have a feeling that, certainly I feel that the commissions can look at very carefully at your report as well, and how it can actually consider what you say in your report in its commission deliberation. So thank you for bringing it up. Yes, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience, Paul. Please remind us who you are as well. It helps for the record.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul Basinga. So one way of thinking about health systems is when you consider 6 dimensions. I think we've been able to tackle 5 of those, but I didn't hear us talking about one of the dimensions. So we talked about financing, we talked about human resources, we talked about data, we talked about demands, we talked a lot about facilities as well. But one is commodities, the whole issue of supply chain. So not being an expert on healthy aging and not trying to medicalize the issues, but I think there are a number of commodities that we will all need to ensure that people live longer and healthier. We didn't really, talk a lot about that. The issue of supply chain, maybe it's, with my African background, we struggle a lot with the issue of stock out and overpriced, etc. So maybe this is something the commissioner could consider more.
Thank you. Over here on this side. Do we have a mic on that side? Yeah. Oh, perfect. Yeah. Please go ahead.
My name is Srinivas Tata. I work for the UN in Bangkok. I just want to pick up on something very important that's come out repeatedly. The importance of this report, any report on health systems is much wider than the health sector itself. I think we've learned about the fact that health systems are too important to be left to doctors alone. I'm a doctor myself, so I think I have liberty to say that. But especially when you're talking about it in the context of older persons, I think it's important that this is a very important initiative, and we need to first kind of address a wider range of sectors than just health. Go beyond to the social sector, to the planning ministries, and really have the messaging in such a way that it kind of addresses an audience broader than health. And within the health itself, I think you ought to be looking at, which has already been brought up very, very strongly, which is looking beyond just governments. Looking at civil society. We know that governments in this present scenario, I think the whole, even our SDG agenda asks us to appeal to a much wider audience than just government. And we know that changes are perhaps more likely to come through civil society and maybe trade unions and maybe the workers, organized labor, than perhaps only government. So this is again, talk about multi-sectoralism in 2 different ways. And third, when we look at the launch of this report, really look at different opportunities, different openings for it in terms of organizations that not just at the national level that you look at multi-sectoral approaches, but even in the way you work on it globally and regionally, to really look at entry points. Where are the entry points where you can really introduce the key findings of this report? And where will you have those entry points? And I believe that we work very closely with WHO and others. We, in the Regional Commission in Bangkok, work on the regular reviews of the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, which is the big umbrella, which I have not heard. I'm sure that it will come up during the last session. But I believe no matter how outdated, SDGs are pretty comprehensive. Maybe they're already outdated in some respects, maybe, but they allow enough entry points. I think it's our duty to mainstream aging into these agendas, and MIPA is a very important area, and I'm hoping that the findings of this report will strengthen our process and informing governments through our review processes. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more, and I really encourage you, if you have other thoughts on what's missing, or these kinds of what are the opportunities, what are the windows and the entry points for this report, to use that email address. We'll put it back up again to send them.
Hello, I'm Peter Piot. Like to just re-emphasize what the previous speaker said, and not without repeating it, but I think one of the questions was what's lacking, who should be involved, and so on. And I think the risk, what I heard, is that the risk would be to medicalize old age, and that's a new form of ageism. And I think that's doomed then to fail. So we have to get out there. I think this can succeed if there is a movement that's being created, driven by older people and also young people who one day, hopefully, will get old in a healthy way. And who's absent is civil society. So I think it's really important to think that, and I hope that the report will emphasize that. So it's not only going to WHO, but also that's where the power is. It's in the treasuries, finance ministries, where budgetary decisions are made. But then also there's a really growing bottom-up type of movements, and they will, I think, creating, because it's really what I've been impressed by, and my lesson is that we're talking about creating a new type of society. And a new way that societies had never confronted with, because people were not living enough. And so maybe giving some thought how to do that. And that's filling in the bureaucratic term of multisectoriality, which of course puts everybody to sleep. But it has really a lot of meanings that are, I think, required to make this a success. The health and medical component is only one aspect of it. Of course, without health, you can't do the rest. But so that's what I think, since the challenge was to react to what we thought would be lacking. Over.
Thank you. So I have one last question for the panel to go through, but I'm actually posing it to the entire room. I'm going to put them on the spot to answer it. But I'm putting you all on the spot to answer it for yourself, maybe chat about it with each other over the break. Maybe write it down on a piece of paper and look back at that piece of paper in like 3 months. The question is, what's one thing that you will do differently as a result of what you've heard at this workshop? What's one thing that you will do differently as a result of what you've heard at this workshop?
I can answer that. That is an easy one, because I'm currently managing a big provider organization. So what I'll probably do different is that I'll get into what I said before, looking at the care we are providing for people that are affiliated with us, and perhaps looking at what are the teams that we need to use to differentiate the functional and emotional support. I do think that. And then what are the metrics we could use to explore if there are improvements in their lives. Yeah.
Thank you for going first.
So I have different part, but in 3 months' time, Japan will host the third workshop. So definitely I would like to bring the discussion from first and second one feed into the third one, so to have a nicely summarized outcome of it.
The one thing I would do is give a second hard look to the issues of inequities or inequalities in everything we do, in the design of long-term care systems, even in the community-based organizations, yes? We are aware of the point that was raised about community-based organizations that could enhance inequities. I know many community-based organizations that did so. The ones that were presented in Vietnam certainly are not enhancing inequities. On the contrary, promoting more equity in life in general, no, in all aspects of life. But I think this issue of inequalities, like climate change, both are issues that was highlighted somewhere. Both are issues that will have a strong influence in whatever we do with the health systems, in the long-term care systems in the future. And the other point that I would do different is try to put the long view, 20, 30 years ago constantly. Now, where are we going? What type of society are we building?
Thank you. Okay.
I think it will be along the lines of what we discussed earlier about the society that we're going to look at. And there I use the terms of the contract of the human endeavor, which is really about individuals in the community. And within individuals in the community, the contract is one, of course, what rights do we have as individuals, what responsibilities and obligations. And when then in terms of our role in society, what are our obligations to society, because that will determine in terms of the fairness, the equity that we talked about. And then also defines in terms of who defines wellness, who defines quality, what's important to me as a person, and then what are my obligations in terms of when I express those. So those would drive in terms of what we're looking at in the future when we have this healthy longevity. What does it mean for me to be healthy? So healthy longevity is just a tool. The objective is for human attainment in terms of the things that we want to do. And then what are the components of our systems that need to change, the institutions of how we have a contract in terms of what society has, in terms of what are my rights and the contract with society, and then how this is recognized, not in the pay that we get, but of course even the financing systems, the way that we reward people or that we enable people to lead lives. Because it's now captured in pay, in reward systems, but maybe even that can change. It's in terms of what are the resources that enable each person to achieve his or her potential, his or her preferences, and then within that, what obligations that this person have to use those resources. And then what are the choices that can be made? And how can we make those choices? Because we all have difficulty making, even under our own preferences. So we talk about preferences as something which is easy to define. It's quite difficult. It also depends on the support you're given, the choices that you have, the resources that you're given.
Allison?
So I think my work is around health system strengthening and capacity building for human resources for health. And when I'm thinking about what I've learned from this session is really thinking about how to factor in ageism as a source of structural discrimination when we're thinking about research, when we're thinking about policy, and making sure that that is a much more of a conscious factor in terms of research design and policy making instead of something that's sort of on the periphery or a side factor. So really linking ageism with sources of structural discrimination in health services delivery.
And Linda.
Well, I'm going to reflect on two things I keep chewing on. One was David Canning's comment yesterday that I thought was quite profound, that we have completely gotten it wrong, that we keep trying to twist people into meeting the needs of our systems and institutions and financing. And we got to flip that one around. And the other thing is I need to figure out whether there are ways to put young people and old people together to create from the bottom up human-centered design vision for the world they want to live in.
Thank you for indulgence in me letting it run over a little bit, and a round of applause for all of you and for our moderators. We have a break now, and then it's the for real final push.